The airport was quieter than usual that morning, the kind of quiet that made every small sound stand out. Wheels of luggage rolling, soft voices echoing through the private terminal, and the distant hum of engines getting ready for another long flight. In the middle of that calm space, a woman named Lena walked in with a slow, relaxed step, almost as if she had all the time in the world. She carried only one bag, not the kind of bag people usually bring on a long private flight, something simple and worn at the edges. No one paid much attention to her. Most people thought she was just another assistant or someone traveling on behalf of a bigger name. Lena did not look like someone who owned anything important. That was what she preferred. She liked blending in, moving quietly, and seeing how people behaved when they did not know who she really was. Her clothes were clean but plain. Her hair was tied back the way someone might do if they wanted to move quickly without attracting attention. There was a calmness about her that could be mistaken for shyness, but it was actually something she had learned over years of staying humble despite her position in life. The private jet she was about to board sat outside the glass wall of the terminal. It was polished, bright, and freshly prepared. The airline staff had been told earlier that an important inspection passenger could be on the flight, someone who might observe how the crew worked, but they were not told what that person looked like or when exactly they would arrive. That created a bit of nervousness among the crew, especially for the flight attendant assigned to the front cabin. She had been working long hours dealing with heavy schedules and carrying more pressure than she'd like to admit as she arranged magazines, wiped down seats, and adjusted the safety cards for the third time. She muttered under her breath about the possibility of being judged by someone who probably had no idea how hard the job really was. Her frustration kept growing, even though no one had done anything wrong yet. She looked up occasionally at the terminal doors, expecting someone well-dressed, someone who looked like they belonged to a world of wealth. Maybe a person with expensive shoes, shiny luggage, and a sharp presence that stood out. But Lena walked through the terminal quietly and did not fit any of those images. She stepped up to the check-in counter, and the ground staff gave her a quick glance. They greeted her politely, but without any special attention. One of them asked for her ticket number, and she handed it over without saying much. The staff member typed on the computer, nodded, and waved her through. Everything about the moment felt ordinary, almost too ordinary for someone boarding a private jet. Lena walked toward the gate area, where another staff member checked her boarding pass again. He smiled at her, but gave the kind of smile people give when they're not sure if they should expect more. She thanked him softly and followed the marked path toward the plane. The wind outside brushed gently against her face as she approached the stairs. She paused for a brief moment, taking a slow breath, enjoying the fresh morning air. She always liked the feeling of stepping onto a plane she technically owned, but she never wanted anyone to treat her differently because of that. She wanted to see the world the way regular people saw it, inside the aircraft. The flight attendant stood in the aisle, checking rows for the last time. She had an expression that showed she was tired but still trying to keep herself together. When Lena stepped inside, the attendant glanced up, then looked her over quickly. The look was not rude, but it carried a hint of assumption, an assumption that Lena was not anyone important. Just another person sitting where she probably didn't need any special attention. "Welcome aboard," the attendant said, her voice polite but lacking warmth. "Thank you," Lena replied with a friendly smile. The attendant motioned toward the middle section of the cabin. "Your seat is this way?" She spoke as if guiding someone who might not be familiar with travel. Lena simply nodded and followed her to the row she had chosen, a seat near the back. It was a spot she liked because it offered a clear view of the cabin and the crew. She could observe everything: how they interacted with passengers, how they handled stress, and how they managed emergencies if they arose. She took her seat quietly, placing her worn bag under the seat in front of her. A few other passengers boarded after her, business travelers. A couple on vacation, and one older man who kept talking on his phone. They were all used to flying privately, and they carried themselves with confidence. Some of them looked at Lena briefly but didn't think much of her presence. She didn't look like someone who belonged to their world, and that was exactly what she wanted. As more passengers settled in, the attendant moved around the cabin with a practiced routine. She handed out water bottles, checked seatbelts, and offered anyone who needed help a polite nod. But each time she passed Lena, Her expression stayed distant, as if she was saving her energy for people she thought were more important. It wasn't mean-spirited, just a habit built from assumptions she never questioned. Lena sat comfortably, observing the small details of the moment. She noticed how the attendant's hand shook slightly when she reached for items. She noticed how the woman's shoulders tensed each time a passenger asked her a question, as if she expected something to go wrong. She noticed how she forced a smile when the older man barked an order at her. It wasn't long before Lena realized this was someone who was worried about being judged on her performance. A few minutes later, the pilot stepped out of the cockpit to greet the passengers. He smiled warmly at the group and gave a friendly nod to everyone, including Lena. She returned the nod with a calm smile. The pilot didn't reveal that he recognized Herbie, because like the rest of the crew, he had been told not to react or treat her differently if he noticed her on board. He respected that instruction completely. The flight attendant noticed how the pilot greeted Lena with a bit more attention than she expected. She raised an eyebrow, suddenly curious. She glanced at Lena again, this time with a longer pause, trying to figure out why the pilot seemed unusually polite. But she shrugged it off, assuming he was just being friendly. She didn't think someone dressed like Lena could be the important guest she was worried about. When the pilot returned to the cockpit, the attendant sighed and continued preparing for takeoff. She couldn't shake the feeling of pressure building inside her. She wanted everything to go perfectly today. She wanted to prove she could handle the job without mistakes. But that kind of pressure often makes small things feel bigger than they really are. And she didn't notice how her frustration was slowly changing the way she treated passengers. Lena leaned back in her seat, showing no sign of discomfort. She had seen many days like this, many flights where someone misjudged her, many moments where people assumed she was less than what she was. But she always believed that character showed itself most clearly when someone thought no one important was watching. That was why she traveled like this, simple, quiet, unseen. It reminded her how people behaved naturally. The door of the aircraft closed with a soft click, and the engines hummed louder as they prepared for takeoff. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the flight attendant began her safety demonstration. Her voice remained steady, but there was a sharpness to her tone, a sign that she was trying too hard to sound perfect. Some passengers barely paid attention, while others glanced politely in her direction. Lena watched with quiet interest, noting every detail. When the demonstration ended, the attendant walked by Lena's seat. Lena kindly asked, "Excuse me, could you tell me where the life vest is stored? I want to make sure I understand everything clearly." The attendant paused, surprised by the question. It was the kind of question she expected from a nervous traveler, not someone confident like Lena. For a brief second, she looked annoyed, as if the question added pressure she didn't need. "It's under your seat," she replied quickly. "It's always under the seat." "That's standard." Lena nodded, not offended at all. "Thank you. I appreciate it." The attendant forced a tight smile and moved on. From her seat, Lena watched how the cabin settled. She noticed how the couple nearby whispered about their vacation plans. She noticed how the businessman adjusted his files and prepared his laptop. She noticed how the older man kept talking loudly on his phone even though the plane was preparing for takeoff. And she noticed how each of these moments pulled the attendant's attention in different directions. The woman looked stretched thin, one small inconvenience away from losing her patience. But Lena stayed calm. She knew she was here to observe, not to interfere, at least not yet. As the engines roared and the plane began rolling toward the runway, Lena felt the familiar rush of acceleration. She knew soon the plane would lift into the sky, and with it, the quiet tension in the cabin might grow stronger. She watched the attendant one more time, seeing the nervousness rise in her eyes. It was a small detail, but it told Lena everything she needed to know. This flight was going to reveal much more than anyone expected. And it was only the beginning of the journey that none of them knew they were a part of. The plane climbed slowly into the sky, the engines humming with a steady rhythm that filled the cabin. The clouds outside were soft and bright, giving the view a peaceful look. Inside the aircraft, however, the feeling was very different. The tension that had started earlier continued to grow, quietly settling between the passengers and the crew. Most people didn't notice it, but Lena did. She noticed everything. As the jet reached a comfortable cruising height, the passengers settled into their own little worlds. The couple 2 rows ahead laughed quietly while looking at pictures on their phone. The businessman opened his laptop and started typing fast, barely blinking. The older man finally ended his phone call and leaned back with a sigh. He's already acting as if the whole world should revolve around him. And the flight attendant moved back and forth through the aisle, trying to keep her stress hidden behind small, strained smiles. Lena watched her carefully. The attendant's steps were a little too fast, her breathing a little too sharp, her gestures a little too stiff. She kept checking the same things again and again, as if she expected something to go wrong at any moment. The pressure of the inspection flight had clearly gotten into her head. Even though she didn't know the inspection was already quietly watching from seat 1 to B, when the seatbelt sign turned off, the cabin loosened up a bit. People stretched their legs, opened bags, and adjusted pillows. The attendant went straight into service mode, preparing the drink cart. Normally, she moved with confidence, but today her hands trembled slightly as she arranged cups and napkins. She kept glancing toward the cockpit door, probably wishing she could ask the pilots how much longer the flight would take. But she stayed silent and pushed the cart down the aisle. When she reached the first row, she greeted the passengers with a friendly tone that sounded practiced rather than real. They didn't seem to notice. They asked for drinks, she handed them over, and everything looked fine on the surface. But with every row she passed, her stress became more visible. A small mistake here, a rushed answer there, a forced smile that faded too quickly. She wasn't rude, but she wasn't calm either in that. Combination created a subtle tension that grew with each moment. By the time she reached Lena's row, the attendant was already under more pressure than she knew how to handle. She stopped by Lena's seat and forced a smile. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her voice tight. "Just water, please," Lena replied softly. The attendant poured water into a cup, but her hand shook enough that a few drops splashed onto the tray. It was barely noticeable, but she reacted as if she had spilled the whole cup. She sighed sharply, as though annoyed at herself, and handed the drink to Lena without looking her in the eye. "Thank you," Lena said. Offering a warm smile, the attendant nodded quickly and moved to the next seat before the moment could soften. Lena watched her walk away, the tension in her body heavy enough for anyone paying attention to see clearly. She wondered how many flights this woman had worked through without rest, how many days she had pushed herself past her limit. It was easy to judge someone's attitude, but much harder to understand the pressure beneath it. Lena took a sip of her water and let her mind wander for a moment. She remembered when she first started her business years ago, working under people who treated her like she didn't matter. She remembered the long nights, the heavy expectations, and the feeling of being invisible even when she was doing all the work. She had built her company with the hope that people who worked for her wouldn't have to feel the way she once felt. That was why she traveled like this quietly without attention. She liked to see reality, not rehearsed behavior. Half an hour passed. The drink service continued smoothly until the attendant reached the older man in the first row on the right side. He was already irritated for reasons no one fully understood. Maybe he was tired. Maybe his phone call annoyed him. Or maybe he just liked acting like the most important person on board. Whatever the reason, when the attendant asked him if he wanted a drink, he didn't respond with kindness. He frowned, pointed at the cart, and said, "I asked for tea earlier. Why did no one bring it?" The attendant blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't hear you ask before. I can make you some tea now. Should have been paying attention," he snapped. A few passengers glanced his way, uncomfortable with the sudden tension. Lena looked up from her seat and observed the attendant's reaction closely. The woman swallowed hard, trying not to let the comment break her composure. "I'll prepare it for you right away," she said softly. She hurried to the galley, moving faster than she needed to. Lena could see the embarrassment in her shoulders. She could also see the exhaustion that had been building since before the flight even started. Instead of letting passengers' frustration slide over her like she usually did, she was internalizing every comment, blaming herself too harshly. A few minutes later, the attendant returned with the tea. She placed it on the man's tray table with care, but he barely looked at her. He waved her away with a simple flick of his hand, as if he expected someone else to clean up the air around him. The attendant stepped back, her face blank. She turned away quickly before her expression could show how she really felt. Lena wondered how many times this woman had been talked down to. People often forgot that flight attendants were human too, people with lives, worries, families, and personal struggles. Today, this one seemed to be carrying far more burden than she could handle. About an hour into the flight, Lena decided to stretch her legs. She stood up slowly and walked toward the back, passing the attendant, who looked busy but distracted. When she reached the restroom, she paused for a moment, hearing the faint sound of someone taking a deep breath behind the galley curtain. She didn't mean to listen. The small gap allowed a glimpse of the attendant leaning against the counter, eyes closed, clearly overwhelmed. It wasn't dramatic, just a moment of someone trying to hold herself together. Lena stepped back quietly so she wouldn't intrude. She returned to her seat and sat down, thinking. She knew the attendant wasn't behaving perfectly, but she also knew that people could only handle so much before their patience cracked. She didn't want to judge her harshly. She wanted to understand her better. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence. Nothing dangerous, just a gentle shake that made a few passengers grab their armrests. The attendant came out quickly, asking everyone to sit down. Her voice was louder than before, almost sharp. Lena could tell it was driven by worry, not anger. The turbulence passed in seconds, leaving behind a tense silence. Some passengers murmured to each other, trying to lighten the mood. The businessman went back to typing. The couple whispered again. The older man stared out the window as if bored, and the attendant continued her work, her shoulders rigid. When she passed by Lena again, Lena smiled kindly. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. The attendant froze, surprised. She hadn't expected anyone, especially someone she assumed was unimportant, to ask her something so human. "Yes, I'm fine," she answered quickly. Too quickly. Lena nodded gently. "Just checking." The attendant didn't know what to say to that. For a moment, her expression softened, but then she quickly straightened herself and walked away. She didn't want anyone to see her cracks. Another hour passed. The flight continued smoothly, but the pressure inside the attendant grew heavier. Every small sound seemed to irritate her. Every question from a passenger felt like another weight added to her shoulders. When a child 2 rows ahead dropped a toy and it rolled toward the aisle, the attendant picked it up with a smile that was too tight for comfort. Lena noticed. She noticed how the smile didn't reach the woman's eyes. The real turning point came during the second drink service. As the attendant rolled the cart through the aisle, she accidentally bumped it against a seat. It wasn't loud, but the small thud startled her. She bit her lip and whispered something under her breath, clearly frustrated. When she reached Lena again, she asked the same question as before. "Would you like something else to drink?" Lena thought for a moment. She wanted to ease the tension somehow, maybe with a simple conversation. "I'm fine for now," she said kindly. "But thank you." The attendant nodded and moved on, but her frustration didn't go away. If anything, it grew. When she reached the older man again, he asked for more tea, in a tone that sounded like an order, not a request. She poured it quickly, but because of her shaking hands, the cup filled too fast. Some tea splashed onto the tray and onto his sleeve. Not much, but enough for him to react as if the whole drink had been spilled. "Are you kidding me?" he snapped. Several passengers turned toward the noise. The attendant's eyes widened. "I'm so sorry, sir. You need to be more careful," he said loudly. "This is ridiculous." The cabin grew quiet. People stared. The attendant froze for a second, her face draining of color. Then she grabbed napkins and tried to hand them to him, but he pushed them away. "I don't want excuses. Just do your job properly." The words hit her hard. Lena felt the air shift, the mood tighten. She could see the attendant's breathing turn shallow. She was on the edge, one more push away from losing control. The attendant apologized again, cleaned the small mess quickly, and moved the cart forward. But as she passed Lena, her eyes looked distant, almost dazed. Lena wanted to say something supportive, something calming, but she knew the moment wasn't right. The attendant wasn't ready to hear anything yet. When she reached the back of the cabin, Something small slipped from her hand, a napkin packet. She bent down to pick it up. It wasn't a big deal, but in her mind, it was another mistake piled on top of too many already. She stood up quickly, her face tight with frustration, and pushed the cart back up the aisle. She wasn't seeing clearly anymore. She wasn't thinking calmly. She was simply trying to make it through the flight. As she reached Lena's row again, Lena tried gently. "Is everything all right? You look a little tired." The attendant stopped, turned, and let out a breath she had been holding for too long. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice cracked slightly. "Just a long day." Lena nodded. "Sometimes long days feel even longer when people forget you're human too." The attendant froze. No one ever said things like that to her. Not passengers. Not strangers. She didn't know how to respond. For a moment, something in her expression softened, but then she quickly stepped back and pushed the cart away as if trying to escape her own emotions. Lena sighed softly. She wasn't upset. She wasn't hurt. She simply understood. Another hour passed in a blur of small interactions, tension, and forced politeness. The attendant tried her best, but her patience was thinning, her energy fading, and her sense of control slipping. The pressure she had been holding inside all day had nearly reached its limit, and Lena, sitting quietly in her seat, knew that something was coming. She didn't know when or how, but she could feel the shift in the air. People always revealed their true selves when stress pushed them far enough, and this flight, though peaceful in the sky, was getting closer to the moment that would change everything. The sun had shifted across the sky by the time the flight reached its halfway point, filling the cabin with a soft golden light that made everything look calm on the surface. But inside, the tension that had been slowly building was far from calm. It hovered in the air the way humidity clings to a warm day, quiet, sticky, impossible to ignore if you paid close enough attention. Lena sat quietly in her seat, taking in the atmosphere around her. She had traveled countless times, on both private and commercial planes, and she had seen many flights filled with stress. But something about this one felt different. Something felt heavier, as if the smallest spark could turn the whole mood into fire. The flight attendant moved through the cabin again, trying to keep herself composed. Her shoulders were tighter than before, her steps quicker, her patience thinner. Everything she did now had a rushed, nervous energy behind it. Even the simple task of handing out snacks looked like a challenge she had to wrestle with. She stopped by each row, offering packets of nuts, chips, or cookies. Some passengers accepted them politely. Others nodded without looking up. A few didn't respond at all, too busy with their screens or conversations to notice the strain on her face. When she reached Lena's row, she held out the basket with a stiff hand. "Would you like something?" she asked. Lena took a small packet of cookies and smiled. "Thank you." The attendant nodded automatically and moved on without another word. Lena didn't take her silence personally. She had seen enough to understand that the woman wasn't intentionally cold. She was drowning quietly in expectations, pressure, and fatigue, and she didn't know how to keep her head above water anymore. A few rows ahead, the older man from earlier signaled the attendant by snapping his fingers. The sound cut through the cabin sharply, making a couple of passengers turn their heads. The attendant's expression tightened, but she forced herself to walk toward him. "Yes, sir," she asked. "My tea is cold." "Bring me a fresh one," he said without looking up from his tablet. She swallowed her frustration and nodded. "I'll bring it right away." She took the old cup back to the galley and prepared a new one, her hands moving stiffly. Lena watched the scene with a thoughtful expression. She wondered how many years this attendant had spent in the air, serving people who didn't see her as a person with feelings. She wondered how often she had been pushed past her limits with no one to care. A few minutes later, the attendant returned with the new cup of tea and placed it gently on the man's tray. He took one sip, frowned, and said, "It's too hot now." The attendant froze, her jaw tensed. Her eyes burned with the frustration she had been fighting all day. But she forced a smile, even though it didn't reach her eyes. "I can let it cool for a moment," she said softly. He muttered something under his breath about incompetence. and the attendant walked away quickly before she reacted in a way she couldn't take back. Lena felt the energy shift again. The attendant was dangerously close to the edge now. She could see it in the woman's pacing, in the tight way she breathed. In the small mistakes she made that she normally wouldn't, there was a storm happening inside her quiet. Unseen, but growing stronger every minute. Meanwhile, the couple a few rows up started arguing softly about their travel plans. Their whispering became louder than they intended, and the attendant kept glancing at them nervously, as if their disagreement added another layer to her already overwhelming day. The businessman kept tapping his pen against his laptop keyboard, creating a repetitive sound that began to irritate several passengers around him. The tapping didn't bother Lena, but she noticed how it made the attendant flinch each time she walked past. Every little thing was adding pressure. Every little thing was pushing her closer to breaking. And then, the moment that would change everything began, not with shouting, not with anger, but with something small and simple. Lena dropped her empty water cup. It rolled down the aisle, gently bumping into the flight attendant's shoe just as she was walking by. The attendant picked it up automatically. Something in her expression shifted. She turned toward Lena, and for a moment, she forgot to breathe. It was as if her body registered the small inconvenience as a personal attack, even though she knew deep down that it wasn't. "I'm so sorry," Lena said gently. "It slipped out of my hand." The attendant nodded stiffly. "It's fine," she said. But the tight tone in her voice said otherwise. She walked toward the galley, holding the cup as if it were much heavier than it really was. Lena sighed quietly. She hadn't meant to make the situation worse. She wished she could help the woman calm down. But she also knew that approaching someone who was holding themselves together by a thin thread could backfire. Sometimes the gentlest question, "Are you okay?" could feel like a needle poking a wound. 20 minutes passed. The cabin grew quiet. The sun began to lower, changing the light inside the plane from golden to warm orange. The pilots made a gentle announcement, informing the passengers that they were on schedule and would reach their destination in a couple of hours. The news relaxed most of the passengers, but not the attendant. She was still carrying the stress of the earlier moments. She moved through the aisle again, collecting trash, but her movements were too sharp now. She was no longer hiding her frustration. She was too tired to mask it. When she reached the older man again, he held up his empty cup without even looking her way. "Get me another tea," he said. The attendant's breath caught. For a moment, she didn't move. She stood there, staring at the cup like it was something that had insulted her personally. Her chest rose and fell quickly. Her eyes flicked around the cabin as if searching for patience she no longer had. Then she took the cup and walked toward the galley with crisp, angry steps. The businessman looked up from his laptop. The couple stopped whispering. Even the older man seemed surprised by the sharpness of her movement. People were beginning to feel the tension too. Inside the galley, the attendant placed the cup down harder than she meant to. She closed her eyes tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't angry at the passengers, not really. She was angry at herself, angry at her exhaustion, angry at the pressure of trying to be perfect on a day that had been far from perfect. She prepared the tea again, her hands trembling. The tea bag tore slightly, leaking tiny leaves into the cup. She cursed under her breath, grabbed another bag, and tried again. But her frustration made her clumsy. The second bag slipped from her fingers. Falling into the sink, she felt something snap inside her. A thin crack in her patience suddenly widened into something she couldn't control anymore. She leaned against the counter, her eyes burning with held-back tears. She didn't cry, not fully, but the emotion sat behind her eyes like a heavy stone. After a long minute, she took a deep breath and wiped her face quickly. She opened her eyes, forcing herself to appear professional again. She couldn't fall apart. Not here, not now. She carried the cup of tea back toward the older man. Her hands were steady enough, but her expression was stiff, unreadable. She set the cup down gently, but instead of thanking her, the older man frowned and said, "Why did that take so long?" The words landed like a final blow. The attendant stared at him, speechless. Her jaw tightened again. Her breathing quickened. She had been trying to hold everything inside, but the pressure had become too much. And unfortunately, fate put Lena right at the center of what happened next. The attendant turned sharply to continue down the aisle, and her elbow brushed against Lena's arm, not hard, but enough to startle both of them. It was a small, accidental touch, the kind that normally wouldn't matter. But today, it mattered. The attendant spun around, her frustration bubbling to the surface, and for the first time, her voice carried something sharp and defensive. "Can you watch your arm, please?" she said, far louder than she intended. Lena blinked. "I'm sorry," she said calmly. "I didn't realize I was in the way." It's always something the attendant snapped before she could stop herself. "I'm trying to do my job." Several passengers looked up, surprised by the tone. Lena stayed calm, her voice steady and gentle. "I understand. It's been a long day." The attendant's breathing grew faster. Her eyes filled with a mixture of embarrassment, exhaustion, and panic. She hadn't meant to snap. She knew she shouldn't have. But she felt trapped inside her own emotions, unable to pull herself back. She began, but her voice caught. "Forget it." She turned too quickly, and her hand brushed against Lena's shoulder again, this time with a sharp, frustrated gesture, as if pushing away the reminder of her own mistake. Passengers gasped softly. The attendant froze. And Lena, who had been patient the entire flight, simply looked at her with calm eyes that held no anger-only understanding. At that moment, the pilot opened the cockpit door to step out for a routine cabin check. He saw the scene. He saw the passengers staring. He saw the flight attendant standing stiffly, suddenly pale. And then he saw Lena. His face shifted. Visibly, instantly, the attendant followed his gaze. Confused at first, then her eyes widened. The pilot spoke her name softly, but firmly. "That's the owner," he said. The cabin fell silent. The attendant felt her stomach drop. Her eyes flicked to Lena again. The realization hit her like a wave. The woman she had snapped at, the woman she had brushed off, the woman she had treated like a problem. She owned the aircraft. The attendant's knees wobbled. Lena simply sat there, still calm, still gentle, still human, yet now surrounded by the sudden shock of truth spreading through the cabin like electricity. And the moment everyone thought would pass quietly had just turned into the beginning of something none of them could ignore. When the loud gasp echoed through the cabin, the whole jet seemed to freeze in midair. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the aircraft itself had stopped breathing. The passengers who had witnessed the slap were still staring wide-eyed, their hands either over their mouths or frozen mid-gesture. Some still had their phones raised, unsure whether to press stop or keep recording. The woman who had been slapped sat completely still, almost too calm, as if she had trained herself long ago not to react out of emotion. She blinked once, slowly, and drew a steady breath. That single, quiet breath carried more dignity than anything else in the room. The flight attendant stood stiff, her hands still halfway in the air, as if she didn't fully understand what she had done, or perhaps didn't believe she had actually done it. Her face had drained of color. The noise from the engines felt louder than usual, because everything inside the cabin had gone silent. A few seats away, a man pressed the call button so hard his finger trembled. Another whispered to the person beside him, trying not to be noticed. The situation didn't look like something that happened on a private jet. It looked like something no one ever expected to witness in real life. Then, from the small cockpit door, the co-pilot appeared. He stepped out quickly, having heard the commotion from the front. His eyes moved across the cabin, trying to make sense of the tension in the air. It didn't take him long. He saw the terrified flight attendant, the stunned faces of the passengers, and finally, the woman sitting quietly in her seat. When he recognized her, his expression changed so fast, it almost seemed unreal. His posture straightened instantly. His voice softened, but carried the weight of deep respect. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked gently, almost carefully. The moment he said "ma'am" in that respectful tone, the flight attendant's eyes widened. She looked back and forth between them, confused. She had never heard anyone address a passenger with that level of seriousness, unless they were dealing with someone extremely important. And even then, the co-pilot's expression didn't match normal protocol. It was more than respect. It was recognition. A few passengers exchanged glances, whispering to each other. The woman nodded calmly. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady, not raising, not cracking, not showing the slightest hint of anger. But the co-pilot didn't relax. If anything, he grew more tense. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Should I inform the captain?" he asked her. The flight attendant's breathing hitched. She opened her mouth slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight, as if the air around her was shrinking. Something wasn't right, and she could feel it deep in her stomach. The woman shook her head softly. "Not yet. Let's keep everything stable for the passengers." The co-pilot nodded respectfully and stepped back, but before he turned to leave, he looked sharply at the flight attendant. It wasn't angry. It wasn't rude. But it was the kind of look that made someone realize they had made the biggest mistake of their life. The flight attendant swallowed hard. Her hands shook as she reached for the counter behind her. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew enough from the co-pilot's expression to understand one thing very clearly. She had crossed a line she didn't even know existed. One of the passengers raised a hand slightly and whispered to the co-pilot, "Is everything okay? Was she someone important?" The co-pilot hesitated, then answered quietly, "She's not just someone important." His voice dropped to a whisper almost too low to be heard. "She owns this aircraft." The whisper traveled through the cabin like wind through leaves. Passengers leaned toward each other, eyes growing wider with each shared breath. The flight attendant froze completely. Her heels stuck to the floor as if her shoes had melted into the carpet. Another passenger leaned forward and asked in disbelief, "Wait, she's the owner?" The co-pilot nodded again. "Yes, she founded the company. She's the reason this airline even exists." The flight attendant's knees almost buckled. She reached for the back of a seat to steady herself. Her face felt hot and cold at the same time. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was fear, real fear, the kind that made the edges of her vision blur. The co-pilot returned to the cockpit, but the air he left behind felt heavy. Everyone stared at the woman with fresh eyes, not out of shock at her wealth, but at the fact that she had been treated worse than any passenger, let alone one of the highest-ranking people in the whole company. The woman herself remained calm, sitting upright, her hands resting gently in her lap. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares, but she didn't look up. She had been through many things in life: doubt, judgment, pressure, and disrespect. None of this was new. What was new was being treated this way in a space she had worked so hard to build for others. Finally. The flight attendant stepped forward very slowly, her voice trembling. I didn't know," she whispered, barely audible. "I didn't mean to," the woman raised a hand calmly. "Don't speak now. Just focus on the passengers." Her tone wasn't harsh. It wasn't unforgiving. It was controlled, orderly, professional, the tone of someone used to leading people, not reacting emotionally. The flight attendant nodded quickly, tears beginning to collect at the edges of her eyes. She turned away, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. She tried to straighten her uniform, but her hands shook too much. Every movement felt like a reminder of what she had done. Passengers watched her in silence. A few looked uncomfortable, some sympathetic, others quietly judgmental. No one said anything out loud. The mood in the jet had shifted completely. What had once been a normal flight now felt like a life lesson unfolding in real time. For the rest of the flight, the woman sat quietly without asking for anything. The flight attendant kept as much distance as she could without failing her duties. Whenever she passed by, she did so without making eye contact. Every time she heard a passenger whisper, she felt her heart pound harder in her chest. She just kept thinking, "I ruined everything." Later, when the engines softened and the pilot announced their descent, the cabin grew tense again. The flight attendant wiped her hands on her uniform as though trying to clear away the anxiety running through her fingers. She didn't know what would happen when they landed. She didn't know if she still had a job. She didn't even know if she could speak without crying. But she did know one thing: whatever happened next, she had brought it on herself. As the jet touched down smoothly, the passengers leaned back in their seats. The woman finally looked out the window, watching the runway lights blur past. Her expression was unreadable. Not angry. Not sad. Just thoughtful, as if she was rehearsing the decision she would soon have to make. When the door opened, a small group was waiting outside: security personnel, senior staff, and operational managers. They stood straight, their posture full of respect and readiness. Clearly warned ahead of time that something serious had happened, the flight attendant's breath caught in her throat. She felt faint for a moment. The woman stood up slowly, gathering her small bag and walking toward the exit with calm footsteps. Every person in authority lowered their heads slightly as she approached. She nodded back politely, but didn't smile. Behind her, the flight attendant stood frozen, unable to move, her eyes burning with tears she couldn't hold back anymore. She didn't know whether to follow or stay or speak or remain silent. The woman paused at the door, then turned her head just slightly, not enough to make it dramatic, but enough that the flight attendant could see she had been acknowledged. "After the passengers leave," the woman said quietly, "you and I will talk." Oh. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't loud, but it carried power. The type of power that didn't rely on shouting or threats. The type of power that made everyone in the room straighten their posture automatically. The flight attendant nodded. Her voice caught somewhere between fear and regret. "Yes. Of course," she whispered. Passengers began disembarking slowly, still unsure whether they should speak or simply leave quietly. Many gave the woman soft, respectful nods on their way out. Some whispered apologies on behalf of what they'd witnessed. She returned each gesture with a calm, polite expression. And then, when the cabin finally emptied, only the woman and the flight attendant remained inside the jet. The door clicked shut behind the last passenger. Silence filled the aircraft again. But this time, it was a different kind of silence, one thick with expectation, consequence, and truth that could no longer be avoided. The woman turned to face the flight attendant fully for the first time since the incident, and that was where the real conversation began. The moment the door closed and the passengers were gone, the cabin felt strangely quiet. It was the kind of silence that didn't just fill the air but touched the heart too. The woman stood at the front of the jet, calm and collected, her small bag resting on the floor beside her. The flight attendant stood halfway down the aisle, her hands tightly clasped together, her breathing unsteady as she tried her best to remain composed. She didn't know how to start. She didn't know whether she should speak first or wait. Her eyes were already wet, but she kept blinking to hold herself together. The woman took a step forward, not rushing, not dragging her feet, just moving with a grace that came naturally to someone used to responsibility. "Come here," the woman said softly. It wasn't an order. It wasn't harsh. It was simply a request. But in that quiet space, it felt powerful. The flight attendant walked slowly, her steps almost shaky, until she was standing a few feet in front of the woman. She kept her gaze lowered, ashamed to even look at her. "Lift your head," the woman said gently. The attendant raised her eyes, and the moment they met, the tears she had been holding back slipped down her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away, embarrassed to cry in front of someone she had wronged so deeply. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I know saying sorry doesn't undo anything. I know what I did was completely wrong. I should have been patient. I should have been respectful. I don't know what came over me. The woman raised her hand gently, signaling for her to stop. "You don't need to explain everything right now," she said. "Just breathe." The flight attendant nodded, taking a long, shaky breath. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The engines were off, and the humming that usually echoed through the cabin was gone. Leaving nothing but the faint sound of people working outside the aircraft, the woman finally broke the silence. "Do you know the part that troubled me the most today?" she asked softly. The flight attendant shook her head slowly. "It wasn't the slap," the woman said. "It was the way you looked at me before it." The way you saw me as someone you didn't need to treat well, that look told me more about what went wrong than your hand ever could." The flight attendant felt her heart break inside her chest. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. "This company," the woman continued, "was built to create safe spaces for people. Not just for passengers, for staff too. For everyone who steps onto any of my aircraft. The reason I sit back quietly during flights is because I want to see how people behave when they think no one important is watching." She paused. "You showed me today that you need help. Not punishment alone. You need understanding, guidance, and a reminder of what service truly means." Right. The attendant's voice trembled. I thought you were going to fire me," she whispered. The woman sighed gently. "Firing someone is the easiest thing to do. But easy choices don't always make people better. What you did was wrong, deeply wrong, and it will not be ignored. But I also believe people can learn if they truly want to." The flight attendant stared at her, surprised. You're not firing me?" "Not today," the woman replied, "but you will face consequences. Real ones. And you will grow from them." The attendant nodded quickly, thankful yet still frightened. "I'll do anything," she said. "I'll learn. I'll work harder. I'll fix myself. I know I need to." The woman watched her for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Let me ask you something," she said. "Why were you so stressed today?" The flight attendant hesitated, then spoke softly. "My personal life, it's been messy lately. I've been overwhelmed. I shouldn't have brought it into work, but it just followed me." The woman nodded. "We all have difficult days, but your personal struggles should never become someone else's burden, especially not passengers who trust you." The flight attendant lowered her gaze again. "Look at me," the woman said gently. She lifted her eyes again. "You made a mistake. A big one. But you're not the first person to make a mistake while struggling with life. You won't be the last either. What matters is how you move forward." Tears filled the attendant's eyes again. "I don't want to be this person. I don't want to treat anyone like that ever again." "Good," the woman replied softly. "Then you'll have the chance to prove it." The woman stepped past her and sat in one of the cabin seats. She gestured for the flight attendant to sit in the seat across from her. The attendant hesitated but obeyed quietly. "You will go through retraining," the woman said calmly. "Not just customer service training, emotional management, stress handling, compassion training. You will work with our senior staff for several weeks. You will learn how to handle pressure without taking it out on others." The attendant nodded quickly, grateful for the chance. "And after that," the woman added, "you will return to work. And you will remember this moment. Not as something that ruined your career, but as something that changed it." The attendant wiped her cheeks again. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't deserve this kindness." The woman looked at her steadily. "You deserve the chance to become better. Everyone does, if they are willing." They sat in silence again for a moment, both letting the weight of the situation settle. Then the woman spoke with a softer tone. "You know, when I started this company, I was treated poorly many times. People underestimated me, spoke to me badly, judged me without knowing me. I promised myself that one day I would build something different." She looked around the cabin slowly, a place where respect didn't depend on money, clothes, status, or skin color. A place where everyone was treated with dignity. The attendant swallowed hard. She understood now. She understood the deeper meaning behind everything that had happened. She felt ashamed, but she also felt something else: opportunity. The woman stood up. "Come with me," she said. The attendant rose quickly, following her down the aisle toward the exit. Outside, the senior staff were waiting. They stood respectfully, ready to assist in whatever the woman decided. She faced them calmly. "I will send a full report later," she said. "For now, I would like this flight attendant to be escorted to the training department. She will begin her corrective program immediately." The staff nodded and stepped forward, before the flight attendant followed them. The woman turned to her once more. "I don't want you to fear me," she said softly. "I want you to learn from this. Use it to grow, not to punish yourself." The attendant nodded, fresh tears shining in her eyes. I will, she said. I promise. The woman offered a small, gentle smile, just enough to show that the future wasn't ruined. Only redirected, the attendant whispered. Thank you again, before she walked away with the staff. Once she was gone, the woman stepped off the aircraft and walked toward her waiting car. The sun was beginning to set, spreading warm colors across the runway. She paused for a moment, watching the light fade slowly behind the horizon. It had been a long day, a stressful day, but it had also been a reminder of why she built her company in the first place, not to show her power, not to show her wealth, but to show that leadership isn't about ruling over others, it's about guiding them. As she got into the car and closed the door, she allowed herself a deep breath. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new challenges, new flights, new people, new chances to make something better. But for now, she felt a quiet peace. Because today, she didn't just correct a mistake, she helped someone find a new path.